Hello and welcome to the Imprint Weekly Podcast. I'm John Kelly, Senior Editor of the Imprint, a daily news site covering child welfare and youth justice around the country. You can read all of our coverage at imprintnews.org or check us out on Facebook or Twitter at the Imprint News. You can also sign up on our homepage for our free weekly and monthly newsletters, and for professionals in child welfare and youth justice, subscribe to our Youth Services Insider section for a closer look at news on business policy and practice. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is also a member of the SafeCamp Audio Network. You can check out our show page and all of SafeCamp's other great podcasts at safecampaudio.org on the web, at SafeCamp Audio on social media. On this week's podcast, we are joined by Wendy Smith, a veteran psychotherapist and former professor and dean at the University of Southern California School of Social Work, about her new book, Before Their Crimes: What We're Misunderstanding About Child Trauma, Youth Crime, and the Path to Healing. Smith conducted dozens of interviews with adults who, after receiving very lengthy or even life sentences for crimes they committed as youth, were given the opportunity for parole as a result of relatively recent justice reforms that passed in the state of California. In the majority of this book's chapters, Smith really lets her subjects speak directly to the reader as she examines the ways in which trauma during these formative years of life and their adolescence shape the context around the time when they committed a heinous crime. We talked about the prison visit that sparked the idea for this book, how she structured the research, and most importantly, we traded thoughts about what these stories reflected more broadly about the ways that we should be thinking around addressing childhood trauma as crime prevention. So without further ado, here is our conversation with Wendy Smith. All right, we are joined today by Wendy Smith, veteran psychotherapist, former professor and dean at the University of Southern California School of Social Work, and most importantly to today's conversation, author of Before Their Crimes: What We're Misunderstanding About Child Trauma, Youth Crime, and the Path to Healing. And this book leans on the life stories of more than 24 people who were sentenced to lengthy time in adult prisons for serious crimes committed as youth, and an exploration, really, of what circumstances and context often exist around children who commit such crimes. So, Wendy, thanks so much for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, John.
Okay, house rules, which Wendy knows, since we're getting into weighty topics almost always, including in this conversation. We keep it light at the beginning. Wendy, I'm going to ask you to give them at least one favorite in these categories. You can give them more than one if you'd like. But our pop culture categories are movie or TV show, musical group, sports team, or book. Can you give me one? Can you give me all five? What do you got for the people?
Movies, I liked in the last year Sinners and Train Dreams. And in TV, I like a lot of things. I like Slinking, obviously. I like Hack. Nothing else comes to mind immediately.
Those are really good ones. I have my brother and my mom both swear by Shrinking. I don't have Apple TV right now, so I'm saving up and getting this. Hacks is like all time funny to me. Just one of the funniest. I love that show so much. So this story really begins in 2013 when Governor Jerry Brown, former governor of California, signs SB 260. And for people that aren't from California or don't remember this, for the first time, people sentenced to lengthy adult prison sentences for crimes committed as youth have this guaranteed timeline to a chance at parole. That sort of leads to your arrival at Pelican Bay State Prison. Can you talk a little bit about how that law caused you to get there and how this all got started for you?
So I had been invited by Elizabeth Calvin, an amazing lawyer who works for Human Rights Watch, who was really a primary driver of not only that groundbreaking legislation, but other similar ones, like getting rid of youth life without parole sentences in California. We knew each other through Human Rights Watch, and she invited me to join her and a group of advocates, some lawyers, as the social worker in the group, to go to not only Pelican Bay, but other prisons to inform people who might be eligible for these youth offender parole hearings and to help them learn about how they would need to prepare.
And my recollection, sorry to interrupt before we keep going because I want to hear the rest, is that my recollection was that was a real, like, it needed to be a sprint, right? Like, he signed the law in 2013. And I think the way it was set up, it was like, so this is going forward, going to happen for everybody, but also like for all the people that are inside now, you got to get it done. Like you have to make sure they all know and have a hearing for like in a 2 year span, right? Or something pretty fast.
There wasn't so much a time limit, but obviously there were a lot of people who needed to know,
Yeah.
considering where they might be in their sentences, because they
Right.
might be approaching the time where they could be eligible.
Sorry to interrupt. So keep going. You guys go out there as a team to educate.
Went to Pelican Bay and they asked me to do two things. One of them was to lead what we call the insight groups, which would be like 10 or 15 men discussing how you need to begin to think about your understanding or develop your understanding of what caused you to commit your crime. Because in these parole hearings, they obviously want to know that you take accountability and have changed in some way so that you're no longer at risk of committing the same kind of crime or anything.
Yeah.
So that was one thing I did. Another thing they asked me to do, actually, there were a couple of things. Another was to lead a meditation, which I thought was a pretty iffy prospect for a middle aged Jewish white lady, not a formerly incarcerated person, to stand in front of 70 men who would they join me? That I really
Right.
imagine that they would. Surprisingly, when I asked them to close their eyes, take a deep breath, put their feet on the floor, almost everybody responded. And in fact, seemed when we did our evaluations later, asked them for feedback, that was something they all, or many of them, spoke to as a really important piece of the experience. In that visit, we spent a day in solitary. And in those cells, people are, they may never have physical contact with another person. And there was one person who had recently renounced his gang ties, and they asked me to speak with him alone. He had to be further isolated from all the other prisoners because if you renounce, your gang is not happy.
Right.
So we spoke alone, and he really began to talk about his early life. And I would say that was the moment when I started to think about writing this book.
Because of the way that he opened up to you
Yes.
about that. Yeah.
And because I could see and feel that it was a really restorative experience for him, even though it was maybe 20 minutes. And also that this was a part of what happens to most people in prison that is invisible to the wider world. Their crimes are what's visible.
Yeah. So describe what is the process from there for like how this work comes together. I'm interested in you obviously you work out a way to get significant amount of time with a number of people and you can talk about that, but I'm also just interested in how you came up with the questions and your strategy for getting what you wanted as a basis for the book.
The first thing really I did was I asked Elizabeth, who had access to a site that many are incarcerated and formerly incarcerated people use, to request people who would be willing to talk to me about their childhoods. As I began to respond to those responses that came in, I realized that I would have to limit my interviews to people who were released because the barriers in prisons to having a long conversation with anybody,
Right.
taping it, that was out of the question. You might get a 15-minute phone call that would not be private. So the kinds of questions that I wanted to ask would not be something somebody would talk about from a prison phone.
Right.
So fortunately, there were enough people who had recently or not so recently been released who were interested. So I met with them either in person or by phone. And we spent anywhere from 1 hour to 2 hours to two interviews to talk about the questions that I asked them.
You ended up talking to almost 30
Yeah,
people for this, like
yeah,
29, right?
yeah,
And there's 20 of them who are in the book. This is just one of those things that came up for me because we're covering things in the justice and child welfare space and speaking to people with lived experience all the time. How did you talk to communicate with those other nine? That's always a tough conversation. I say you're not actually in it, but was that like a tough thing to do?
yeah. Although said there were some of them that had dropped out.
Oh, and preferred not, so
Yeah,
they preferred
yeah,
not to be.
yeah.
Yeah.
But the people who had talked with me, but who I couldn't include, I sent them the book and I told them I would be sending it to them. And I said, I thanked them for their participation, but that I wasn't able to
Yeah.
include everybody, which I couldn't.
So it's obviously an emotional thing. And to your point, restorative for some people to just talk to you the first time for these interviews, but then reading it back, because I'm assuming you shared a lot of these passages with
Yeah.
people and contemplating, oh, this is going to be out there.
No, exactly.
Yeah.
Before I was going to submit the manuscript, I sent to each person what from their interview I planned to include. And there were a couple of people who at that point said that they would prefer not to or decided one way or another about using their real first name. So yes, I
Yeah.
mean, they were very candid with me.
Very. And Wendy says this about her own efforts with this book kind of early on in it, but you went around looking for publishers. And I think your suggested in the introduction was a lot of them were looking at the material like, I don't know who wants to read this much sadness. I'm glad you found somebody to, though, because it is important stuff. And look, you're not somebody that came into this out of nowhere, like, oh, I think I'll write about the criminal justice system. You've been around child welfare, you've been around youth justice in California in particular for a long time. So the trauma of children is hardly a new phenomenon to you that you were exploring here, but there are definitely parts of this book where you seem to convey a real struggle to get your head around what people were telling you. Is that fair? Is
Yeah.
that what it was like at the time?
I would say that happened maybe in two different ways. One was, yes, some of the crimes were horrendous. And when somebody would first tell me, you don't know what someone has done when you sit down. And sometimes I was shocked. And I didn't want that to interfere with their ability to go on talking to me. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I did struggle with maintaining, yeah, a neutral face. The other way that it was very challenging was what you mentioned earlier, the pain and aloneness of these children and what they had to survive with no real help.
Yep.
And I don't think I think I had a general idea that things had happened in their childhood that accounted for what they later did, but I don't think I fully grasped how universal really their childhood suffering was.
Well, obviously, you went into this not seeking to prove that childhood traumatic experience contributes to terrible decisions that people make. I think it starts from that premise. I read it more as an attempt to bring that often clinical premise talked about in clinical and professional circles to life for a reader who maybe is not in that world. Is that something that you set out to do? What would you say was your goal in putting this together? Who do you want to read it, and what do you want them to take away big picture here?
I think I had the dual goal. Certainly, I wanted to educate people about how it can happen that kids commit violent, unthinkable crimes, that it doesn't just arise out of nowhere. People aren't like the bad seed. Things have happened that have brought them to that moment. The other part of it was that I wanted to have their voices speak. That was very important to me. And there were some publishers who thought I should just tell all the stories, but I really didn't want to do that. I felt, and I think many readers have told me that it's actually their words that are the most powerful part of the book.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think that the way that you chose to present it really is a strong way to do it. Just leaving uninterrupted segments where you're almost reading it like autobiographically from what the young people are telling you. Yeah, I would agree. That is very powerful.
Nobody said adoption and foster care were easy, but it's easier when you're not alone. The Families Rising Adoption and Foster Care Conference brings together hundreds of adoptive, foster, and kinship parents, lived experts, and child welfare professionals. Together, we'll talk about the tough stuff in child welfare, bring hope to our kids and families, and of course, earn CEUs while we do it. Let's get refreshed and re-energized to serve kids and families in need. All at the virtual Families Rising Adoption and Foster Care Conference on October 21st and 22nd. Register today and take advantage of our early bird rates at wearefamiliesrising.org/conference. That's wearefamiliesrising.org/conference.
So you set the table with some explainer chapters around ACEs. Let me not assume people know adverse childhood experiences, the young brain and stress response, and big kind of conceptual things that are helpful to know as you're about to start reading. And then you kind of, each chapter takes on a different adverse experience, if you will, like domestic violence is one, physical sexual abuse, death of parents, substance abuse, the role of gangs. And the stories of the interviews are kind of weaved into all these chapters, which I think made a lot of sense. You got all these stories, you got to find a way to kind of channel it in some organized way for the reader's minds. My question for you, though, is did any pattern or characteristic really jump out and surprise you, a person who has been in this world, like I said, for a long time? I guess in the two ways that I was thinking it might have would be like, where there was one experience or characteristic really prevalent in a way you didn't expect? Or was there a combination that jumped out? For example, wow, death of a parent and experiencing neglect went together more than I thought. You know what I mean? Did stuff after decades of working in therapy and in social work, were there things that surprised even you?
That's a great question. I think probably the biggest surprise, if you could call it that, but it was maybe more like a confirmation, was not any single type of experience, but the general aloneness with overwhelming experiences. I think a common theme might be looking and longing for love. That doesn't sound very clinical, I know, but I think it's at the heart often of what is happening with these kids. I think the other thing is that it was almost never a single issue, you know, type of event. There were almost always numerous kinds of risks and experiences that fell one after another or one led to another. So I think it really, and I think I have made this point in the book and elsewhere that because ACEs are, the traditional ACEs are basically in the home, I don't think they really tell the story by themselves because many of these kids was things that happened in the neighborhood, at school, and beyond that also affected how those home experiences got exacerbated or, and in very few cases, helped. But that's where the help could be, is in some of these outside institutions.
Yeah. And that's your sort of procedure, and you don't get into the weeds in the chapters a lot, which I appreciate. I think you did a good job keeping it very human forward facing and less clinical. after the boot camp at the beginning, which was important. I needed to dust off on some of that stuff. But you did mark all of the interview subjects by ACE. You can see that in the appendix. And it was interesting to what Wendy was just talking about. She charted the sort of traditional ACEs that come from the original study, and then your own little homegrown one that deals with what you're talking about, like the environmental stuff.
But I just want to add from your previous question about particular experiences that I would say that the death of a parent, which for whatever crazy reason was not included in the original ACE study, proved to me to be disastrous on its own because of the way it took out the foundation underneath not just the child, but the other parent or caregiver. So it was like you almost, if that happened, somebody's got to do something right away.
That's a really good point. The one that's coming to mind as you mentioned that is the young man whose father engaged in some questionable stuff himself, but then was murdered at the bar. And so you just think about what did that do to that family? Mom all of a sudden has to get a job. She was keeping the house and kind of raising boys. Now she's out there. The expectations on the kids change, and they are left to grapple with pretty uncertain feelings about somebody that's not there anymore. And that's really, it's hard to even get your head around. I think the things that jumped out to me beyond just what the chapters kind of line up, one is it felt very even Steven between situations or experiences they had where drug abuse and addiction drove the spiral and those where it was where the spiral landed. You know what I mean? There were a lot where it's like the drugs started this chain where it got to where they got, and then the other way too.
Yeah, that's very true.
Yeah. And then the other one, I think you kind of alluded to this. There's not a set chapter about disconnectedness, but it's pervasive. And it is the thing that most jumped out to me was just that feeling of reading a chapter about neglect and reading a chapter about parental death and drug abuse. And by the end being like, man, a lot of these times, these kids moved 10 times in 5 years. And just like that physical frequency of movement is it almost kind of emerged through me as like, man, this is like of all the big blinking lights that could be out there. It's a tough nut to crack if you're just kind of like constantly on the move.
And your skills then change every time.
Yeah. Because if you don't have that person at home or that rock, whether it's a sibling or a parent or an aunt or somebody, and on top of that, you're moving, your chances of having it somewhere else go to borderline zero.
Yeah.
And that really felt like,
really good observation.
And I read everything almost with an eye towards like, what's actionable here? I'm going to ask you about that in a minute, but what do we take from this and do something with? And that was honestly the thing I walked away thinking, we probably have to pay more attention to noticing disconnectedness on that level and targeting it with kids. I don't profess to know how, but that was really just why I thought about it a lot as I was reading it. Okay, another thing that doesn't have its own chapter, but is often referred to is foster care, which Wendy literally wrote the book on. She wrote a book about youth and foster care. I can only recall one pretty isolated positive account of foster care by one child who got medical help during his time with them.
In the middle of a lot of
exactly. And who knows if that home was even good. Something good happened while he was in that placement, right? So it's not like this great portrayal of foster care by the interview subjects, but how would you summarize what you heard about the foster care system from them? Were the people who went into care happy they did, even if the care wasn't great? Did the ones who didn't go into foster care tell you they wish they had? In some cases, what did you hear from them about foster care?
There were definitely people who should have and could have been taken into care who weren't. Most of these people, their childhoods flew entirely under the radar.
Yeah.
The people who did go into foster care, there weren't that many, and they had pretty terrible experiences. The people who had more positive, those two sisters, they had very helpful experiences in a group home,
Yeah.
which is unusual, but it gave them the space and the support to envision something different for themselves. And one of them, at least, almost wished she didn't have to go home because she was doing better where she was and had another kind of dip after she went home.
I remember that. Yeah, that was tough to read.
Yeah. But I think, they didn't have that much to say about foster care as a system because most of them were not exposed.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess I was wondering for that group, the larger group, if that came up in your conversations with them, like, I should have been taken. I don't know why anybody didn't do that, or it just wasn't a thing. Yeah.
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 And as you could see from the interview questions, which I included in the book, I really tried to make it pretty open-ended.
As we talked about early on, this book was born of a California policy solution, SB 360. You write really eloquently about how important that bill was really for the system itself and the people incarcerated within it. Can you talk a little bit about that? And then also, I would love any thoughts you have on further policy recommendations that you feel like your book supports or that you'd like to see happen in California or anywhere else.
Okay, so I think one of the most important things about 260 and 261, which raised the age, and then there's another one after that. In California, we have increased the age during which you are considered a youth offender, and that's based on brain science, which supports the idea that your judgment develops late in your 20s.
Right.
I think for many of the people in the book, that was the source of hope that made them begin to face themselves in prison because they realized they could possibly have a life after prison and they wanted to have that, obviously. And they knew the way to get there was to sort themselves out and to stop fighting, drinking, whatever they were doing. So it served as a change agent as well as functionally to allow people to return to life and do meaningful things.
One thing it's a very, maybe it's a weird analogy, but as I was reading your words on that, I was thinking about that bill and the policy that came with it almost as like the state equivalent of a weird spiritual paradigm, especially in Christianity, that I think about a lot, which is like how many bad things have happened because someone's mentality is that they're already going to hell. You know what I mean? Like, how many people just accepted that on a spiritual level, they're doomed. So it doesn't matter what I do.
Right.
And I think that's a very grandiose conceptual mentality, but this is a here on earth rehabilitative version of that. It's like,
That's exactly right. It's like the state saying to you, possibly you have value and could live a meaningful life on the outside. I see that possibility for you. You have to meet me by examining yourself and really understanding what's happened and what you've done and the harm you've caused. But if you can do that, you can return to the community. And I think that is that kind of recognition that you're not going to hell necessarily.
and I don't want to spoil the end. It's obviously, like, as we've been talking about, there's a lot to get through in this book that is very painful to read. But there's a very nice ending where you can read about what everybody's up to that Wendy talked to. But I didn't want to cut off the last part. So if like Governor Newsom called you in, love the book. What do you think this means we should do? We've already done SB 260. What's next, Wendy? What are you telling him and his people?
I think, and I think there's work going on about this, about reducing the transfer of juveniles to adult court or adult jail or adult prison. I think for juveniles who are imprisoned, what happens to them from the beginning should be continuing education and treatment. It shouldn't be that because your crime is onerous, you don't have access to these services. And I think greater recognition of the fact that when you're 18 to 30, you're very receptive to learning. We should take advantage of that. We shouldn't make people wait for anything that they could be learning and doing that would make them better citizens eventually. In other words, I guess we should be thinking about the people we want them to become. But I think my interest in changing investments and policies is really about the first 5 years of life, and the first year of life, when I think if we visited every new parent and took a look at how they're doing, what they know about parenting, how their baby's doing, we could save a lot of people and money eventually. I think if schools, you mentioned earlier, we need to find a way to notice when kids are moving often. I think schools need to find ways to notice when kids are in trouble and to not remove them, but to keep them in school and help them with the problems they're having.
Yeah. Be part of the solution, not the problem. Yeah, for sure. For sure. All right. The book is called Before Their Crimes: What We're Misunderstanding About Child Trauma, Youth Crime, and the Path to Healing. I will drop a link in the show notes for this interview for anybody that wants to go and get it. Wendy Smith, thank you for joining us on the Imprint Weekly Podcast.
Thank you so much, John. It's been really a great conversation.
Thanks to Wendy Smith, author of Before Their Crimes: What We're Misunderstanding About Child Trauma, Youth Crime, and the Path to Healing, for joining us today. The Imprint Weekly Podcast is a production of the Safe Camp Audio Network, which is a division of Fostering Media Connections. Please visit safecampaudio.org on the web or at Safe Camp Audio on all major social media. This podcast is produced and mixed by Christine Adjoko, with music by Luke Giroux and Cyrus Elliott. If you enjoyed this episode, we would love it if you would consider subscribing or giving us a 5-star rating on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you download your podcasts. And we would greatly appreciate if you would consider supporting our work here on the podcast and in print. Small donations from our readers and listeners go a long way towards helping us grow and cover more great stories in child welfare and youth justice. To support us, it is very easy. Just visit imprintnews.org/donate. You can follow The Imprint on Twitter and Facebook by searching the handle @TheImprintNews and visit us on the web at imprintnews.org. You can always get us over email at tips@imprintnews.org. I'm John Kelly, and we'll see you next week.